Good afternoon for those of you on the East Coast, and hello to everyone from wherever you're. We're glad that you have joined us today for Cost Connects, the good power of science. Today, we're going to be exploring the plastics problem. This year, we have been developing these conversations, Cost Connects, about how we're not only using our research to solve the grand challenges of the world, but also providing powerful experiences for all of our students at any level. And so today we have Professor Aron Stubbins with us, along with two of his students, Karina, who's a PhD student, as well as Ariana, who is an undergraduate student. So a little bit about them. Professor Aron Stubbins grew up in rural Wales, learning about the connections between people, the land, rivers, and sea. He studied at Newcastle University in England, receiving a PhD in marine biochemistry in 2002. He then moved to Old Dominion University in Virginia, where he became an associate director of the Virginia Coastal Energy Research Consortium before taking a faculty position at the University of Georgia's Skidway Institute of Oceanography. He joined Northeastern in 2018 as an interdisciplinary appointment between the departments of marine and environmental sciences, chemistry and chemical biology, and civil and environmental engineering. We also have with us Karina Ramos. She is a PhD student in the Marine and Environmental Science department, excuse me. She's a native of Milford, Massachusetts, and her academic background is in analytical chemistry, environmental chemistry, chemical toxicology, K-12 education, and science communication. Beyond her experience in the program when she completes it, she would like to remain engaged in primary age students in education, science education, form of program development, teaching, and/or science programs. We're also pursuing a research career. We also have Ariana with us, native of South Windsor, Connecticut, is majoring in environmental science with a concentration in chemistry. Her research interest and academic interest as a fourth-year undergraduate student, looking at the plastic phenomena that we're currently going to explore today, and interested how plastics and other man-made materials move through the environment. Post-graduation, she anticipates spending a few years working in industry before also coming back into academia to pursue a graduate degree. And I apologize, usually you would see a different face here. Dean Siv unfortunately could not be with us. She is actually with another commitment today, but I'm happy to be in her place as I'm Associate Dean of Development, Kevin Thompson. But once again, thanks to all of you for joining us, and I will turn it over to Professor Stubbins and his two students. And then after we hear a brief presentation, we'll also have an opportunity to ask lots of questions of our guests.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining today. Sorry we can't see you all in person, but it's great that we're all online together. Are we, Kevin? Are we down at this slide? Yeah. So yeah, as Kevin mentioned, and thanks for the great introduction. I'm a joint appointment at Northeastern between the departments of Marine and Environmental Science and Chemistry, and also in the College of Engineering, I'm also an appointment in Civil and Environmental Engineering. And as you'll see from the research that I'm presenting today, and if we want to study the plastic problem, then that interdisciplinary approach is really, really helpful and was a great draw to me coming to Northeastern. And it really lets us, that interdisciplinary approach of the university in terms of the hires it makes, and the classes it lets students take it was a highlight when I came here, and is just a mentality that allows the faculty here to address problems that they might not be able to address at other universities. So I wanted to start with this slide. On the left here, we have this image from a recent special issue in Science magazine. So one of the premier science magazines or journals in the world. And they highlighted our plastics dilemma. And we were lucky enough to have an article, a review article, sort of as part of this special issue. But I wanted just to put this up because it's a nice graphic showing us the plastics in the environment And just to have some bullet points here before we begin. So when we think about plastics, then in the news today, then obviously there's a lot of negativity around plastics, but they still remain sort of a wonder material, just like they were when they were invented in around 1950. So we still need plastics for lots of things. It's not like we're likely to scrub them out of our lives anytime soon, because we need plastics to keep food fresh, to hold water, to transport water through pipes. There are lots of good uses of them. And in these designs where we need plastics, and we make plastics that survive for long periods of time. We don't want plastics decaying in our hands as we're drinking a water bottle, or if we have a life-saving device, a medical device implanted. We don't want that plastic to degrade, and nor do we when it's a safety component in a car or other things like that. And so plastics persist by design most of the time. And so you might hear about people trying to make biodegradable plastics and things like that, but there's just lots of uses where we don't want our plastics to degrade. And therefore, non-degradable or non-biodegradable plastics are likely here for a long time. And we need to sort of reduce our one-time use of those plastics and think about how we manage those plastics as they enter the environment. So because of that persistence and the popularity of plastics, then plastics continue to be produced, and then they survive into the environment, and they don't really break down once they're out there, at least not very fast in most environments. And so when we look around today, anywhere we were to take a measurement, we would find plastics. As you sit there breathing at home or in the office or at school, you will be breathing in small particles of plastic, just like you're breathing in small particles of dust and other things. They're in the air everywhere, in the upper atmosphere as well. And so that transports them around the world. And then they're in all the waters that have been sampled. They're at the base of the ocean floor. They're on the highest peaks in the Himalayas of the Tibetan Plateau, for instance. They're basically and literally everywhere we look. And they've accumulated through time to be really massive store of material as well. So the amount of plastic is always accumulating on Earth because we keep producing plastic, releasing it into the environment, and it doesn't break down very fast. So it's building up through time in the environment. So a lot of the time when we think about plastics, there's some sort of side effects that are kind of just ugly. So if we see plastics in somewhere we would hope would be more pristine environment, say if we're at the beach or we're out in the open ocean, we don't expect to see plastics there. We don't want to see plastics there. And in most of those cases, the plastics can have some negative impact on the environment, but a lot of that is kind of human perspective on just seeing this thing it just seems out of place there. It's kind of, are the plastics more ugly than actually harmful in those instances, is one question. But where plastics could potentially have a lot of negative effects for people and the environment is once they break down and they produce different molecules. So once if you have a lump of plastic, most of the time that lump of plastic is not particularly bad for the environment or for you, which is why we can drink water from a water bottle. That's why we can eat off plastic plates, etc. Right? If plastic was inherently toxic, we wouldn't be able to do any of those things. But as plastics break down in the environment, they can form nanoplastics, tiny fragments of plastics that can get into places we wouldn't want them in our body, for instance, and they can break down into chemicals that might be toxins. And so that's where some of the concern lies on some of the research that we're doing. So I'm going to move on to the next slide now. And this is a figure from our contribution to that Science magazine special issue I was noting. And what you see here is a figure of the plastic cycle at the global scale. And so this is an integration of how plastic moves around the world. And I wanted to tell you a little bit about how I came to produce such a figure and how this got me really interested in studying plastics. So when I started at Northeastern in 2018, I wasn't really studying plastics that much. I'd only just sort of dabbled in studying plastics in the natural environment. And when I came here, I had to develop a new class called Earth's Changing Cycles. And this class details how humans have changed the Earth with a focus on the material cycles, particularly those of water, carbon, and nitrogen. And as part of this class, I included a couple of lectures about plastics as a new novel material in the Earth system, a new a new chemistry, a new material that humans invented. It just wasn't around before 1950. And these plastics, like me and you and all life, and also the fossil fuels that drive our economy, they're made from carbon. Therefore, I compared plastics specifically to the natural global carbon cycle. And in doing so, I realized that plastics are now a major fraction of total carbon and material in some environments, such as at the sea surface, in urban rivers. So in those environments, we find as much plastic as we do natural materials. This realization led me to take plastics more seriously as a global threat and to work on producing such a figure as you see here about the cycling of plastics in the global system. And if we look at this figure, we can see that the amounts of plastics, by looking at this figure, we can see the amount of plastics produced from fossil fuels. So I don't know if you can see. So down here on the bottom, down here on the bottom, there's the production of plastics from fossil fuels going to those factories. And then from there, the plastic ends up being produced and we make plastic products and they end up in our hands and in use in the environment, and then they can be released into the environment. And we can see that some of the plastics end up in rivers and in the oceans. And I sort of took the numbers that I could find from the literature to build this picture of how plastics move around the planet and where we might find them. And in a lot of cases, there's some numbers there. I don't really want you to pay any attention to the numbers presented, but in other cases, you can see that there are question marks. And where there are question marks on this figure, that just means we have really no idea about how much plastic there is in those different places. So for instance, the amount of plastic sinking to the deep ocean, the amount of plastic being buried in riverbeds, we just don't know. We don't know about how much plastic there is in soils, for instance. And so there's a lot of unknowns in this quantitative study of plastics. And so we can think of these question marks as pointing to places where urgent research is required to better understand how plastics move around the planet. And we need to know where plastics are to understand exposure. So for instance, if plastics are harmful to people or other life forms, then it's in the places where there's most plastics that we would see the biggest effects. So we need to understand where plastics are and where they're going to accumulate through time in the global system to understand who and how we might be impacted by those plastics. Another major unknown in the plastic cycle here is how plastic is eventually removed from Earth and what byproducts may be formed as plastics degrade. So as I said, chunks of plastics are unlikely to be toxic. It's okay for us to drink water from a plastic bottle. It's okay for us to eat food off a plastic plate, for instance. However, as the plastics degrade, then they can release a mix of additives. So these are things that are intentionally added to the plastics, different chemicals that are added to the plastics to change the plastic's color for cosmetic reasons or to change its properties, say to make plastics more flexible or make them stronger for different uses. And these additives can leach or wash off plastics into water or into our bodies, for instance, and some of them can be harmful, such as BPAs that you may have heard about, and now we see BPA-free labeling on bottles and other things. And so where we know and have identified some compounds, such as BPA, as potentially harmful, and we can take them out of the process of making plastics, there are other molecules that are produced as plastics degrade that we just don't know about. And they're not things that we necessarily added to plastics either. They are just breakdown products of the plastic. And these unknown chemicals, they're the ones that give me the greatest concern, and that's where some of our research is focused. As we think about things that break down plastics to produce these unknown chemicals, then one thing our lab is focusing on is sunlight. So sunlight can break down plastics and produce these molecular soups of unknown chemicals. And a lot of my work in the natural carbon cycle, so before I started studying plastics, looked at the role of sunlight in surface water, such as the surface of the ocean. And so in some of my initial work on plastics, I also looked at what happens to plastics when they are floating, bathed in sunlight at the sea surface. And a motivation for that work was to assess why there is was to address a question that was perplexing researchers who were studying plastics in the ocean. And so I'll talk about that initial question on the next slide. Yeah, so here we can see a figure showing that there's about 5 to 13 million tons of plastic that enter the oceans each year. So this is coming from rivers and other discarded waste. And when we look in the ocean, we only find 0.25 million tons. So this means that about 90% of plastics entering the oceans become lost at sea. The big question here was, where do they go? And so this question became apparent to me because a student visited my lab. Shown here, this is Lixin Zhu, who was a PhD student in China, but he came to my lab for 1 year to conduct some research. And he was thinking about plastics, and I knew a lot about photochemistry, about how sunlight breaks things down in natural waters. So we did some experiments where we basically added plastics to natural seawater, and we watched those plastics degrade through time. And we stuck them in a sun in a box, a solar simulator, which is basically like a scientific sunbed. And we just watched how quickly and what happened to the plastics as they were sat in that sunlight. We just move on to the next slide. And so this is a caption of a figure showing what we found. So we found that sunlight starts to make the plastics fragment. So at first you start with a big piece of plastic, it fragments into something called microplastic, these smaller plastics, and eventually then it fragments into even smaller pieces of plastic, the nanoplastics. And so sunlight is able to break down pieces of plastic into smaller and smaller pieces of plastic. However, all of these pieces of plastic are still plastic. So they're not going missing yet, they're just being broken into smaller pieces of plastic. The novel thing and the most important thing we measured was the production of dissolved molecules from these plastics. So if you think about putting a cube of sugar in some water, you'll see the sugar dissolve. And so that's what's happening with plastics at the sea surface. It's a slower process and it needs sunlight too. But a mixture of sunlight and sitting in seawater over time dissolves these lumps of plastic into the water. And so far, so good. We showed that sunlight can literally dissolve plastics at the ocean surface. And so sunlight can help clean up the oceans for free. It can help remove some plastics from the ocean. But then what happens to those dissolved plastics is the second question that we addressed. And so when you dissolve sugar or coffee in water, you add sugar molecules and coffee molecules to the water. And just the same as sunlight dissolves plastics, a diverse molecular soup is produced, and there's a suite of molecules, a diversity of molecules that end up in the seawater. So we wanted to test what happens to those molecules as well. So we basically fed that plastic-derived soup to the bacteria from the ocean. And most of the time, the bacteria just fed on it. They were happy. They used that carbon. They used those molecules as food. And they helped remediate or clean up those molecules. They removed them from solution. So in most cases, sunlight dissolved plastics, and then bacteria that naturally live in the ocean were able to clean up what was left over. However, one form of plastic produced a soup that was harmful to bacteria. It stopped the bacteria growing, and it was also persistent in the environment. And the results of this work led to further questions about how quickly plastics dissolve in sunlight, what molecules are produced when plastics dissolve, and when these molecules might be harmful to, in this case, ocean bacteria, but also to other organisms like us. We'll just move to the next slide, please. And so kind of this is where our research sits today. We're focusing on studying how plastics move around the planet, where these plastics break down, what chemicals are released as the plastics break down, and also if any of these plastic products formed are actually harmful to us or to other organisms. And so for time, I'll just skip to the final slide, please. So through our ongoing research, we want to tackle these and other questions with Northeastern students and other Northeastern faculty. Our lab is well qualified to address many of these questions with the right funding, but in the long term, I'd like to establish Northeastern more generally as a leader, describing and addressing plastics dilemma. As a community at Northeastern, we can address other aspects of the plastic dilemma by collaborating across departments and colleges. So just like I have an appointment across different colleges and departments, we can build research networks across those departments and other ones too. And the ability to do that, and Northeastern's forward thinking in that aspect of interdisciplinarity, this combining of different scientists from different disciplines and engineers, etc., to study one thing is one of the reasons I came here. And it really makes Northeastern a university with a more collaborative faculty and a more interdisciplinary outlook than many other universities. As we're developing these projects to study, so we're developing projects to study the movement and breakdown of plastics in rivers, oceans, in local beaches and other environments. And you can see some examples here of places I've worked in the past to study natural carbon cycling. As we develop studies to look at plastics moving around the world, I can build upon my experience and my collaborations out globally, studying plastics, for instance, in glaciers, in Alaska and Tibet, in the Amazon River, that big brown river shown there, the largest river in the world, draining the Amazon rainforest, and out across the world's oceans, where I've worked from the Arctic Ocean to the tropics, and from the surface ocean to the to hydrothermal vents in the deep ocean. So we can start to build a model of how plastics move around the whole planet. But really importantly, as we seek to include more students in our work, studying the amount and impacts of plastics closer to home is a priority. And Northeastern provides an excellent base camp to study the impacts of plastic in Boston's waterways and in rivers and other environments further north or inland, where there's less urbanization. So we can do a lot of really important local work that allows us to involve more students. To do this research and to include students in the most valuable experience, we do need funding. Nearly all my work to date has been funded by the federal government, including NSF and NASA, the National Science Foundation and NASA. Most of my grants include support for graduate students, and federal grants fund most of the PhD students at the university. Karina Ramos will speak to you soon. She's a PhD student and an exception, as she's received a highly competitive Northeastern fellowship. And in my funding, I'm also usually able to include some undergraduate support, but not as much as I'd like. Often the support is limited to providing funds to support a few hours of work per week during a semester, or for a few weeks in the summer. However, in one recent NSF grant, I was able to include funding for a unique experience that would take a student to sea to study plastics, and then also take classes at sea. And this was completely funded, including, and they got credit for those classes. And then the student would come back to the lab to do a fully funded 6-month co-op, doing experiments to assess how plastics dissolve in sunlight. We advertised this experience across the university, getting about 100 applicants. Unfortunately, we could only support one. The process was really competitive, and it was hard to say no to so many talented, passionate students. On the flip side, we recruited Ariana, an incredibly talented undergraduate student who's excelled in the position, and we'll talk to you next. Without students like Ariana and Karina in my lab, my research wouldn't be anywhere near as successful and certainly not as rewarding. So, Ariana, to hand over to you. Next slide.
Yeah, so hello, everyone. As both Aron and Kevin mentioned, my name is Ariana, and I am a 4th-year undergraduate student studying environmental science and minoring in chemistry. I actually transferred to Northeastern after my first year of college, since I was looking for somewhere that I would be able to do more research on the topics that are of particular interest to me, such as environmental chemistry and biogeochemistry. So I'd say that in coming here, I've really gotten exactly what I was looking for. As Aron said, I spent my previous semester in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, participating in a program called Sea Semester, which I was lucky enough to be funded to attend through our grant. So Sea Semester is a 3-month-long program where students spend 6 weeks on the SEA campus in Cape Cod, taking classes in marine biodiversity and conservation, and then 6 weeks on their research vessel, sailing from the Gulf of Mexico back up to Woods Hole, Massachusetts. So during the time on the boat, I was able to conduct research on marine plastics. So I was specifically looking at the time at the biofouling of marine plastics, which refers to the growth of small organisms like algae or barnacles on the surface of those materials. And this is a process that has been proposed as a potential other hypothesis for how all of these small plastics appear to be disappearing from the surface ocean. So my experience with SEA doing this program has easily been one of my favorites during my time at Northeastern, and was also very valuable from everything from my personal and professional development to helping me get a strong hands-on background for my current work in the lab. And if you want to go to the next slide, I can talk a bit more about what I've been doing in the lab. So like many other members of our lab, I am working on research on the photochemical degradation of microplastics. So specifically what I'm looking at is the relationship between particle size and the rate at which plastics degrade to produce dissolved organic carbon. So all of those carbon-containing compounds that Aron was talking about. Based on some work that was previously done in the lab by Lucien, we were expecting to see that the smaller particles of plastic would degrade more quickly. They'd break down and produce that carbon more quickly. So for the past few months, I've been preparing samples of plastic in different size classes, putting them in water, and then placing them under our solar simulator, very similar to our original experiment. So the first experiment, which used expanded polystyrene, which is commonly known as styrofoam, which is shown on the left, is just about wrapped up. And I have some of the data from that shown below. As you can see in the figure, all of these materials degraded very quickly. And we've been excited to see that, as we were expecting, the smaller particles are breaking down and producing carbon the most rapidly. Then in another similar experiment with polypropylene, which is used in things like coffee cup lids and bottle caps and is shown on the right, it's about to get started. So I spent for this project a few days freezing these little standard beads of this material with liquid nitrogen, and then dropping them into a coffee grinder to break them down into a variety of different sizes. And before long, these will also be going into the simulator as well. In all of this, I've had a great deal of autonomy from preparing the samples to collecting and processing the data. And this kind of experience is relatively rare for an undergraduate student especially, and is something that I've been very grateful to have in Aron's lab. And so now I'll hand it off to Karina to talk a bit more about her experience. If you want to go to the next slide.
Great work, Anna. Thanks, Diana, for flipping through for us. So I'm Karina. I'm a first-year PhD student in Aron's lab, and I am in the Marine and Environmental Science department. So I'll start by first explaining my background and experience to reinforce why I chose Northeastern for my graduate program and why Northeastern is a great place to study. And then I'll explain my project and its direct application of chemistry to the plastics problem. So next slide, please. So I did my undergrad at the College of the Holy Cross, which is the image on the left. I was in the HUP lab, and there I refined my analytical chemistry skills and applied it to biodiesel fuel, and really found my passion for science. And following graduating college, the following two pictures on the right is my teaching experience that I got through a joint program with the Jesuit Volunteer Corps and AmeriCorps. And there I taught second grade science, which was such a pleasure, and physical education and art, and found that I was incorporating all of my teaching and applying it to science. So then I recognized in myself, I love science. I want to master these skills, but I also want to apply it to teaching and primary age children. So I was looking for a program that could foster both of these skills, enhancing my science skills and education. So next slide. So why Northeastern? What makes this place so special for me to spend so much time in my program here? So there are two things. Northeastern as a university is so wide casting in the amount of disciplines just within the marine environmental science program, which is really unique. We have everything from social scientists to ecologists to chemists to environmental engineers that work on ecosystems in freshwater and seawater and in rocky shores. So everything from the different ecosystems that we look at to the faculty that does this research is extremely diverse, which I didn't find a lot in my grad school search. And within that, just looking at Aron, he's appointed at 3 different departments. So not only is my department extremely collaborative, our lab itself is made up of different students in different departments, which makes us learning from each other just much more organically possible, which is really, really vital for me. In addition to Northeastern being in the center of Boston with access to so many other graduate students, it makes collaboration easily accessible, and access to the Boston Harbor, which we can see in this image taken in Nahant, which is also where I spend most of my time, seeing as the Marine Environmental Science Department has a huge presence at the Marine Science Center, a lot of marine words built in there, but that's located in Nahant, which is a 40-minute drive northeast, still on the North Shore coast. And it's a great spot to be in, specifically for someone who wants to do outreach like myself, because this program here that I've highlighted on the right, Beach Sisters, is a subdivision of a group from the Girls Inc. of Lynn. And Lynn is a town directly near Nahant that they do so much collaborative work with their after-school programs with girls interested in science. So as you can see, having such a physical presence near a community that is invested into their surrounding towns and interested in educating students was something that was a huge priority of mine and that I have found to be supported in. I just spoke yesterday to the Beach Sisters, which was a group of second grade girls interested in science, or sixth grade girls interested in science, and that was really great. So Northeastern has allowed me to foster both this need and desire to work within community and school-age children, and also work in the lab. And specifically in Aron's lab, I'll be looking at those styrofoam plastics that Ariana showed you a couple of slides back, and looking at how they're being degraded through sunlight to see if there's a known presence of a pollutant in that byproduct. And in doing that, I'm going to hopefully answer or look at questioning 2 of the questions that Aron posed earlier. The first being, what chemicals are being released as this plastic breaks down? And the second is, are these plastic-derived chemicals toxic to us or other organisms? So I'm interested in seeing how toxicology applies to the degradation of plastics, as well as seeing what is actually going on at the molecule level. How far am I on this project? I have just started. I just started my PhD in September. So right now my scientific process just looks like mapping my project and reading literature and seeing who else in the world is doing work in plastics. So it's gathering this breadth of knowledge to then refine it to the methodology of conducting these experiments. And my future interests look like working on these projects, collaborating with community, and refining my reading and writing skills as I work to publish these things alongside Aron. So Northeastern has so far and looks very promising and really meeting these 2 key things and that I want to foster in my graduate education. Great, and I think that's all we had. So we want to open it up to questions, and Kevin, you want to take it?
Yes, thanks, Karina, and thanks, Aaron, and thanks, Ariana. We really appreciate you sharing a lot about your experience in the lab and experience in doing research. Certainly want to echo what you just said, Karina. Any one of our guests that has any questions for our guests, please feel free to put them in the chat, and I'll be happy to read those to our panelists, and we'll get those answered for you. But I wanted to start while people are thinking of questions and putting them in the chat. You talked a lot about this, especially for our two students here, about really what the opportunity, Ariana as an undergraduate student and Karina as a PhD student, to really hone in on the Northeastern model of experiential education. And it's, especially as an undergraduate student, having the opportunity to do this earlier on in your educational journey. What has that meant to you, Ariana? And later for Karina, you've talked a little bit about that, but how has having this experience really propelled what you want to do as well with your PhD program?
Ariana, you want to take it first?
Yeah, I can take it first. Yeah, so for me, when I was originally looking to start college, I was really interested in being able to do research, because I've known for a very long time that is something I'm quite interested in. I did like a lot of field work in high school, and I really wanted to continue with that. And so as I started college, I became much more interested in chemistry and learning about how the activities that humans do, the things that are parts of our economy and the way that we run our societies, how they impact the environment, and how we can see the evidence of that and really measure it and learn from it. And so I've been very glad to have that here. I feel like my experience, especially in Aron's lab, has given me a much richer undergraduate experience than I think I really could have gotten anywhere else. Like, there isn't really anywhere else where you can spend 6 whole months devoted to one particular project in a topic that is of a lot of interest to you. And since I do eventually intend to return for grad school, it's been very useful to me to just get an idea of what it looks like to work in a lab. I've had the ability to talk with people like Karina, who are currently in graduate school, get their insights on that experience and prepare myself better. And really just focus in on what I'm going to want to spend time in the future studying.
Thank you. How about Karina?
Great. So the question was the experiential model of Northeastern and what that means to me, correct?
Exactly.
Yeah. So coming in with the background in chemistry and going into a marine environmental science department meant that I was surrounded by a lot of ecologists and marine biologists. And I think I'm the only person with a strong chemistry background in my cohort. So that, first of all, just creates so much conversation in what people's projects have been. And being in this department means taking classes that put me out of my comfort zone. So I'm taking marine ecology classes and doing field work on the rocky shores. I'm talking about sustainable sciences from the point of human behavior, which is totally out of my realm of comfort. We're not looking at data in numbers at all. We're looking at data in people's reactions to things, which is really different for me to quantify. But these are all skills that lend interdisciplinary work, which this field is. It's all interdisciplinary. So the structure of the department and school model is just, it mimics the real world. And it just it's really revealing to how authentic the experience is to be carried forward. It's not just a bubble of graduate school students. It's a reflection of what the real world looks like after we leave here. And that means a lot to me because we're not going to be in grad school forever. Well, that's the hope. Yeah.
Exactly. Thank you for sharing that. I think that's sometimes lost, when we talk about all the research that we do, it's the individual experiences that really make these things so powerful. And before we get to some of our other questions, I have a question for Professor Stubbins here. It's kind of the flip side of that. What has it meant to you to have, the opportunity to work with our great students here to really help propel your research? I imagine, you talked a little bit about it. It would be difficult as, just one person and maybe a few other assistants, but just can you speak to a little bit of what it's meant to have that experience in your lab as well?
Yeah, so it's rewarding to work with students who bring new energy to the lab and excitement and things, because that can, it's everything's fresh and new for them. So like that's just on a personal level, it's great to have students in the lab for just that sort of cultural aspect of the lab, motivational and other things, trying to help them with things they're excited about and provide some motivation. And then intellectually, it's great to have, just like Karina was saying, folks from different backgrounds, whether that's different scientific backgrounds and different levels of education, coming with different questions, because it's the questions, it's thinking about how to solve questions, obviously, is like part of science. And we spend most of our time doing experiments that are carefully designed to assess something. But the spark to it all is the new ideas. And so having students with different mindsets and different points in their education, they all ask different questions. And that's where the inventiveness comes from. Because we think of science sometimes as dry or as we don't think of it as that creative, but at heart it is, because you need to come up with a new imagination of how the world works. And by talking with different people about different things, you stumble upon ways of thinking about the world that are different, and new questions to answer, and new answers to questions we've had for a long time too sometimes. So, yeah.
All right, great. Thank you for sharing that. So I'm going to turn now to some questions we have in the chat, and once again, feel free to put those in there. Happy to read them to our guests here. So the first one is, I think kind of on all of our minds, we're all taught to reduce, reuse, and recycle, right? So can we really reuse plastic, especially if it's used with food?
Yeah, I mean, washing bottles and reusing them, or washing plastic plates and reusing them, I think that's safe. I'm not a food expert or like a food safety expert, but yeah, there's plastics that are designed for multiple use are fine, and if it says dishwasher safe, etc., it's fine. Read labeling, but otherwise, yeah.
Gotcha. The next question we have here from Daniel on the high density plastic that you were referring to that sinks to the bottom of the sea. How does that get measured? And is part of the plastic just lost at sea? And do we just not know about it, the magnitude?
Yeah, hi Dan. Great question. So yeah, I skipped a little bit there in the presentation for time, but yeah, some of the plastic that gets lost at sea is polymers, the types of plastic that naturally sink. So PVC, for instance, might be one that most folks are aware of. PVC is denser than water. So if you have a PVC pipe or something, if you were to try and float that in the bath, it would sink. So plastics like that will naturally sink to the seafloor. And so about half of the plastic that enters the ocean is denser than water to begin with, so would naturally sink. And about half is types of plastic like the expanded polystyrene, the styrofoam, polyethylene, polypropylene, those types of plastics. They naturally float, they're buoyant. So they'll float and stay at the sea surface. So yeah, about half of it could just be sinking, but that would still leave still a lot that goes unaccounted for. And some of it washes up on our beaches and other places too, as other sinks for it. Other ways that it gets lost at sea, if you want, is that it is no longer in the sea because it got washed back onto land. So when we see plastics on the beach, quite often we might think of them as coming from people on the beach, but a lot of the time they're washed in from the ocean.
Gotcha. And one of the, I guess, a follow-up to that is, we see a lot of the technologies now that are intended to help clean up the waters and the oceans. What can you tell us more about that? Are they effective right now, or is it not enough scale for it to be effective as it needs to be for all the pollution that we've placed in the waterways and in the ocean?
Yeah, so if we take a step back and think about the numbers for a moment, they offer some insight. So if we know that there's a flux, so only about 10% of the plastic that goes into the ocean each year is found in the ocean. And the amount of plastic in the ocean is not really accumulating. It's not, the amount of plastic in the ocean is not growing through time that fast. So every year, 90% of the plastic that goes into the ocean ends up not in the ocean anymore. And so naturally something is happening. A lot of it, some of it sinks to the ocean floor. So by trying to clean the ocean surface, you wouldn't capture that anyway. It's going to sink anyway. A lot of it gets washed back to shore. So it ends up on our beaches and other places. And that small amount that ends up at the surface of the ocean floating there, which is what these technologies often target, is actually just going to get dissolved by sunlight. The main issue here, as in many cases with pollution, is to change the release of plastics. The quickest way to prevent plastics being in the ocean will be to slow down the release of plastics to the ocean. So cleaning plastics up from heavily contaminated sites is a good idea. So if you have a river from some location where you can just see plastic flowing down the river, maybe you can put a screen across that river and capture some of it. That's a low energy, low impact way of capturing that plastic. That's a good idea because the high density of plastic you can clean up. The same thing if there's tons of plastic on a beach, cleaning that up is a good idea. But going out, the expanse of the ocean is, it's the ocean. It's 70% of the Earth's surface. Going and trying to tow a net around that it's a fool's errand. We're going to spend more money and burn energy, drive climate change. I just don't see the practical sense to that. We have to stop adding plastic to the environment and better control how it ends up in dumps, etc.
Gotcha. Thank you. So another question from the chat, and actually this might be good for our students here as well. If someone wanted to do research in this field, but they don't have a background in the natural sciences, what might be a path for them to have a chance at joining a research lab, such as the one that you have, Aron? And thinking about grad school, what are the different pathways to get to kind of where our two students are? Can you speak to that?
Sorry, I was reading the one in the chat and then my at the beginning of when you started speaking. Sorry, Kevin. You just repeat the beginning.
Sure. So the beginning of the question was, assume a student wanted to pursue research in this field of plastics, but they don't have a background in the natural sciences. What might be a pathway for them to work in a lab like yours? And for our students, we talked about your backgrounds and your interests, but what might be alternative pathways? Let's say, I think the example that was given was for someone in computer science, and I think this might be coming from the standpoint too of your lab and your position is really interdisciplinary and taking multiple approaches to a really complex problem. So what can you tell us about different pathways for students?
Yeah, so for any student with any background, I think there's space within the study of plastics, whether it's the physical science that we focus upon, but the social science too that Karina noted, and education. So to control the release of plastics in the environment, we need to change public opinion. We need to understand how people think about plastics to make a change in society. So the social sciences are definitely included in the plastics problem, and with interaction with our lab, we're trying to build some interactions there. Computer science is that's quite an easy one to address. Like on the practical side, we need tools. We do a lot of modeling and things like that. So there's being able to program to be able to think numerically about things, to design scripts that would do those calculations, for instance. you'd have to learn some of the science background. You might know the coding already. And also pattern recognition and artificial intelligence can be used. So we've used machine learning, for instance, to estimate carbon fluxes from marshes to better budget for carbon fluxes from marshes. We're developing a proposal to use image processing to basically have a camera looking down at rivers, and we need some algorithm, whether it's AI, whether it's machine learning, to assess what particle moving under the bridge is plastic and how fast it's moving, etc. So there's definitely, within computer science, there's a lot of space that overlaps as well.
I'd also like to add that it's super important to have an advisor, PI, mentor, what have you, that supports you building on the skills you have, but trying out different skills. I know that the skills I came in with, the chemistry and wanting to project maybe, what if this is toxic to different kinds of animals? What if this is, that requires a skill set that we don't have, I don't have. That means we're going to have to collaborate with toxicologists, with marine biologists, and that's skills that collaboration will lead to, like absorbing all that knowledge. So then that already cross-discipline work is under your belt. So coming in with skills doesn't necessarily mean you'll leave as an expert in just those skills. So the more diverse the lab and the student, and the more willing to learn different things, is half of the battle of finding a lab that is suitable to you.
Yeah, similar to what Karina was describing, from more of the undergraduate perspective, when I started college, I had no intention of doing anything with chemistry. Like I didn't have any real chemistry experience from high school or any of that. And my first year chemistry class that I had to take for my major, since it wound up being interesting to me, what I did, and bless my first year chemistry professor for her patience with me, is I would just work outside of her office whenever she had office hours, because one, chemistry is challenging, get help with the course, and two, it just gave me an opportunity to talk with her when she didn't have a busy schedule with it, talk about things beyond our class, really get interested in chemistry and build that connection. And so even if you don't start off with that background, it's just finding a network of people and demonstrating that you're interested in it, like Karina said, that you really want to learn. And having that kind of support can really just help you get involved in areas that you're passionate about, but maybe you don't necessarily feel like you're the typical person who would find yourself working in that area.
Great advice. Thank you all for sharing from your different perspectives. Really appreciate that. And probably our last question here, and I'm going to make this kind of a two-part question, with especially the last nearly 2 years living in a pandemic situation where there's been such a heavy emphasis on single-use plastics to deliver a lot of things safely to people, food, medicine, so on and so forth. Do you see that as having a larger effect on pollution that we experience and polluting our environment as well? And a follow-up to that too is, do you ever think we'll get to a place that will have an entirely environmentally friendly plastic?
So this is sort of semi-informed wisdom, but on the pandemic, then there's studies out there showing the increased use of single-use plastic, and when we walk around, we'll see discarded lost masks, right, and things like that littering. So it's a new form of litter, a new form of plastic waste out there, and so it's an impact. But there's much, I think, and it's worth studying, and it's obviously in the zeitgeist at the moment. It's what we're thinking about the pandemic still. But it's probably going to fade away in terms of impact. But if you can, make sure you put your mask in the trash properly. If you have to use a plastic one, or use one you can wash. The same as with any single-use plastics. It's best to try and avoid single-use plastics unless they're necessary. Like sometimes food containers need to be single use for packaged chicken or something like that from the store. It makes the chicken last a lot longer, so there's a benefit there if it's vacuum packed, etc. The second one with an environmentally friendly plastic, it's kind of, a lot of pollution's about dose, not about the chemical that we're interested in, like not the specific chemical. And so the plastics that we have today, I think, are fine as long as we don't dump a lot of them into the environment. So it's about managing our use of them and our waste streams more than developing new plastics. Any new plastic we generated, for it to fulfill what we want the plastic to do, we want that plastic to last and be strong and do the things we want it to do. We don't want our computers dissolving in sunlight just on their own, or I don't know, bacteria degrading our drinking bottle. You know, we don't want that to happen. So any plastic is that's used for those contemporary reasons, those main reasons we use plastic, it's gonna be something that persists in the environment. So it's just trying not to use single-use plastics and trying to make sure that the waste streams at the society level are personally, and then also, so at the society level, are managed correctly, so it ends up in the right place. Some of it can be recycled, and if it can't, ends up in a landfill where it stays put.
Well, great. Thank you so much for that. And I think that's kind of a nice note for us to end on today, just thinking about the future and what we can do individually to help alleviate this problem that we're experiencing and contributing to in many ways. So thanks so much for presenting your research and presenting your experience for Professor Stubbins, Ariana, and Karina. We really appreciate everything that you've shared with us today. And to our guests, we want to thank you all for attending this month's Cost Connects. We will see you again next month, but have a great day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Kevin and Diana, for organizing.
Certainly. Thank you.